What do you know of the man, like just his life, Francis Parker Yockey?
Yes. So Francis Parker Yockey is, to call him interesting would be an understatement. The man himself, he was born in Chicago, September 18th, 1917, to a Swiss German and Irish background. He was raised in the Catholic tradition. I don't believe he was practicing, um, and he grew up through sort of the post-war period of the United States, watching the general degradation of it. He was a concert level piano player. Like he was a brilliant piano player. And he could have easily done that. And Willis Carto talks about this in the introduction to the 1960 version. I don't think it was 1960, but the second edition of Imperium, the cover that most people will know. And Yockey got into a car crash in his youth that kind of prevented him from being able to play piano as well as he used to. And a little anecdote that comes from this period when he was playing piano was that he was at some college dean's house, and I guess he just started playing the Internationale on that dean's piano, and he got kicked out. And so Kevin Coogan, who's this crank biographer in the 90s while writing stuff about Francis Parker Yockey, takes this and basically takes the conclusion from that oh, he was a communist in his youth, which I think is complete and utter nonsense. I mean, I think Yockey was just a troublemaker, like a lot of young men are, and he just wanted to cause some mischief, and so that was one of the easiest ways to do that in the 1920 after the in the wake of the first Red Scare, But yes, Yockey attended, a number, like almost, I think, 7 or 8 different colleges. He eventually graduated from Arizona State, his undergrad, and then he went to Notre Dame for his law school. These are kind of the two most important ones he went to, and he graduated law school from Notre Dame cum laude in the 1930s, which is extremely impressive. That was back when standards for law school were extremely high. I think his IQ was tested somewhere around 170, which is like genius level.
That's far beyond genius.
Oh yes,
That's two standard deviations above genius.
Yes, and he was just extremely competent in pretty much everything. I mean, except for being tall, because he was 5'8". But he, whether it was law, he never lost a case. I legit in the years, I think in the decade at which he was a trial attorney in the greater Chicagoland area, he mostly did cases on insurance, but I don't think he lost a single case that he argued. And oftentimes he would, if he didn't have political motivations, he would actually try to self-sabotage himself as much as possible, in order to sort of keep in this weird sort of monasticism, because he lived entirely politically. He would try to self-sabotage himself while arguing cases that did not have any ties to his politics. And his politics, one of the interesting things about America in the 1930s that often kind of gets brushed over, especially in U.S. history classes, at least not in a tangential way, but largely throughout the public's perception, was that in the 1930s, you had a ton of what we would call far-right organizations today that were just everywhere, widespread and socially accepted. You had Charles Lindbergh's America First movement and the Order of 76. You had the Deutsche Amerikanische Bund, which was, even in its day, kind of looked at as like a bit of Kraut sympathizers, but they were socially accepted. You had Bill Pelly's Silver Legion. You had the Black Legion, which was a Klan offshoot in the Midwest. You had the Klan itself. You had, talking about religious organizations, the Masons were very politically active, and they were, they tended to be very right-wing, at least in behavior, if not in intention. Knights of Columbus as well. You had, and you had just all of these, Huey Long, Father Charles Colin, whose radio show, I believe, garnered 3 million. It was either 3 million or 30 million. It was one or the other. Either way, it was a massive, it was the most popular radio show in America. And, his radio show was literally just railing against what he called the money changers and the bankers, which is a certain group of people. And this was like the most popular radio show in America at the time. You had Father Charles Smith, you had Huey Long in Louisiana running his sort of populist opposition to the mainstream Democrats. You had the precursors to the Dixiecrats. I could keep going on and on and on and just listing all of these things, all of these movements, all of these parties that existed in the United States in the 1930s that were explicitly right-wing. And what happens after 1939? Well, as Thomas has explained in your show with how the U.S. entered in Pearl Harbor, Lindbergh said Roosevelt got us in through the back door. And so, as the United States was now at war with the quote unquote far right world, well, all of those fifth columnists at home needed to be smoked out. And so, after the Second World War, and the sort of beginning of the social engineering of the Nuremberg world order, you see all of these, homegrown and native movements in the United States that were completely normal, that were completely accepted, and that were generally engaged with, all of a sudden are wiped off the face of the earth. And Yockey himself, he existed actually at both ends of these. In the 30s, he was a young up and comer. And in the 50s, he was very much sort of one of the only figures after the war who, had the courage or foolhardiness, I suppose, to keep upholding these ideas. In the 30s, he largely did writing and speaking. He appeared at a America First convention under the pseudonym Francis Parker. He was billed as a international law expert from the University of Virginia, both of which were lies. I mean, actually, no, the latter was a lie. The former was true because Yockey probably understood international law, oxymoron as that is, better than anyone. In addition, his first written piece was published in Father Colin's periodical called Social Justice. I forget the title of that piece, but Yockey, and he did legal work for the Silver Legion. He did legal work for the Deutsche Amerikanische Bund. And, all throughout the 1930s, he was very, very active in these far-right political circles. Come the war, he tries to stay out of it, but after 1941, he did kind of what was expected of every man at that time socially, which was enlist in the United States Army. He enlisted in the 42nd Infantry Division in Kalamazoo, Michigan, was sent to basic training, underwent that. I do not know what specific job training he got while he was in the Army, because, if you go into like these dog tag databases, you can actually find his name. His serial number is known. His rank was private because he enlisted. But after he undergoes this initial training period, he goes AWOL for about 4 to 5 months down in Mexico. And what he was doing was that even as early as in the 1930s, he was turning himself into one of these OSS intelligence types. Another notable man who was a confidant of Yockey, very similar sort of worldview and pedigree, is H. Keith Thompson, Harold Keith Thompson, who was another one of these very far-right figures. He was in correspondence with European royalty, old money New York type, waspy. He joined the United States military during the war, and the whole time H. Keith Thompson was a double agent. He was I think he was taken on by SD, which was SS intelligence, and actually later in his life, he would never swore oaths of loyalty because, he said that he only ever wanted to swear one oath of loyalty in his life, and that was to Adolf Hitler. And H. Keith Thompson becomes a very close confidant of Yockey around this time, and even even later on. But basically, Yockey, after getting back from being AWOL, he kind of tricks this army psychiatrist into giving him a medical discharge, off of psychological reasons or whatever. And then for the rest of the war, he goes around the country providing intelligence to what we would call Axis intelligence assets. He was in Peru with an Italian intelligence agent giving information on U.S. Merchant shipping. It is very likely that Yockey actively contributed to the success of the Kriegsmarine during the Wolfpack during the War for the Atlantic, because the Kriegsmarine was very, very able to coordinate with these intelligence assets and understand where these U.S. merchant convoys were coming. Because as Thomas pointed out, after Lend-Lease, the United States was essentially in the war in all but name. We were escorting these British fleets with U.S. merchant ships and U.S. Navy assets, and so the Kriegsmarine did exactly what I believe was right and proper in that situation. But after the war, Yockey returns to he's in Chicago. He's a well-known lawyer, and right around when Nuremberg starts picking up, Yockey is a relative unknown by the United States government. He's actually kind of a small fish, and they don't really know much of his background. So they needed all of the lawyers that they could have gotten for the Nuremberg trials, and Yockey, among many others, was hired to kind of write trial reports. He wasn't on the ground arguing, or in the courtroom rather, arguing evidence, but he was there to write trial reports for the second string Nuremberg trials, like the doctor's trial and other such lesser tier 2 Nazis, or second string Nazis as they were called. During this time, he befriends General Otto Riemer, who is the single individual responsible for saving Hitler's life during Operation Valkyrie, because he was the one in command of, I think, the Wehrmacht Reserve at the time. I could be wrong on this, but he is a if you've seen the Tom Cruise movie, he is actually in the movie. He is who Himmler shows up. It's his headquarters that Himmler shows up at, and he is the one who decided not to carry out the order to mobilize the Wehrmacht Reserve to arrest all of the SS people and essentially coup the Nazi government. And so Yockey very much befriends. Yockey speaks fluent German. He spoke several languages, I think, and he befriends General Riemer, and does everything, but gives him evidence and works with him and several other individuals from this sort of Third Reich crowd. Because Yockey, and you'll see this in some of his earlier writings, but Yockey kind of saw the whole thing as just one big scam, one big degradation, desecration of law. It was a joke, to make an understatement. It was literally ex post facto. You're guilty of laws we are now making up. Goering of all people, I think, did the best to kind of just dismantle the entire argument. And that's why he, Thomas will talk about this as well. But Nuremberg was such a joke in how the United States Judge Advocate General Corps and the civilian lawyers they brought over were just climbing fences halfway through trials, making up evidence. It was a kangaroo court if there ever was one. And Yockey would not he would not stick with the message. He wouldn't write trial reports the way that his superiors wanted him to. So he was kind of given an ultimatum. It was just like, well, write these reports the way we want you to write them, or get the hell out. And he's like, all right, well, I'll see you. And so this is around, I think, 1946. So he goes to England. He's making travels all across Europe at this time, working with what would later elements that would later become Otto Rehmer's Socialist Reichspartei, which was, the best way to describe it was almost exactly the Nazi Party immediately after Nuremberg. and it got, I think, something like 30% electoral support in the first election. It was the first party banned by the German federal government under the joke of a constitution that is the Grundgesetz. But he makes acquaintance with Oswald Mosley and several of the former individuals within the British Union of Fascists. And in 1948, Yockey goes to British Bay, Ireland, a very isolated village with a single hotel. And over the course of, I think, a year, a little bit less than a year, without notes, writes that 600-page paperback I believe you read, Imperium, entirely from memory, entirely off the top of his head, and takes it and presents it to Sir Oswald Mosley, and he says to him, "I will publish this under your name." And Mosley kind of looks at him and he says, "Thank you very much. I appreciate the compliment, but no." And Mosley never read Imperium. He never even glanced at the thing Yockey was offering, but several of his underlings did. Several of his fellow travelers, of his confidants, looked through Imperium and said to Mosley, "What the hell are you doing? This is brilliant. This is amazing. This is revolutionary, and you're just kind of spitting in this guy's face." And this is one of the primary events that kind of caused the irrelevancy of Mosley post-war, because he was very much willing to get with the program of the NATO agenda and the anti-Soviet sentiment. So Yockey publishes it under a pseudonym, Ulick Varange, and it only I think 1,000 copies were ran of the first edition. I have never seen nor laid hands on a first edition of Imperium, but it was published in 2 volumes. The first one was bound in I think brown leather. The second one was bound in black leather. But they are exceedingly rare. And Imperium, but they all sold out within like 2 weeks of publishing. And okay, so after this, Yockey goes around and kind of turns himself into this self-made, homespun intelligence asset. He works anywhere and everywhere for anyone that he believes will support his political views. He goes to Egypt and works for Gamal Abdul al-Nasser, who was head of the anti-British. I think they were the Arab nationalists. Forgive me, Middle Eastern history is not one of my areas of specialty, but I do know a little bit of Nasser. And Yockey starts publishing this anti-Zionist propaganda, because this is around the time when the State of Israel is being set up. You have the War for Israeli Independence, and Yockey greatly grew to admire Nasser. Like he very much, he saw in Nasser kind of the type of man that he believed was needed to stand against this growing what we would eventually call global homo. But he doesn't stay with Nasser for more than, I think, a year or so. He picks up, and then he, I think actually vis-a-vis Nasser, doing him a couple of favors, he was able to get behind the Iron Curtain. He was present, like in the courtroom, watching the Slansky trials, which is when the Czechoslovak government convicted 11. There were 12 people on trial, and 11 of them were Jewish, and so the Czech government convicted these 11 Jews as being traitorous and corrupt. And it was over the course of that trial, and I believe his extended stay behind the Iron Curtain, that Yockey came to the conclusion that the Soviet Union was the lesser evil as compared to the growing United States empire. And he talks about why in the book Imperium itself. But his correspondence kind of drops off after he goes behind the Iron Curtain, because obviously if you're a U.S. national and you're working behind the scenes for your nation's primary geopolitical adversary, obviously you would not be writing things down, and that which you would be very quickly disposed of. So he leaves the Iron Curtain, right? Thomas believes, and I agree with him, that he became an asset either for Czechoslovak or East German intelligence. This whole time he's publishing pamphlets in German. He's having his printing presses raided and destroyed by the West German police. He's trying to keep up networks of friendly people politically, but he's flying back into the United States in 1960, and he flies into, I believe, Los Angeles airport, and his suitcase gets sent to the wrong place. So the airline attendants open up the suitcase to determine whose it is, and they find, I think, 5 or 6 passports, several different identifications, names, information, all this other stuff. And so Yockey, who's staying at a friend of his, a Jewish rabbi actually, in Oakland, is arrested and brought to the San Francisco County Jail, in which he is brought before. He's held for a $15,000 bail, which is ludicrous for passport fraud. I have read through I think all 6 volumes of the FBI's files on the individual Francis Parker Yockey, and this was intentional. This was very intentional. They were keeping tabs on him for a very long time, interviewing his close friends, his family, character associates, and all of that. And he once they got him for that, I think they knew that they weren't going to let him go, and I think he knew that they weren't going to let him go. So over those 11 days, he becomes acquainted with Willis Carto, who I don't know if it was him that started the Institute for Historical Review or someone else, but Carto becomes very influential within the later American far right, and Yockey and him have a very close acquaintanceship. And Yockey kills himself with the cyanide capsule he kept in his shoe 11 days after incarceration in order to protect his political contacts, which he put in his suicide note. And Willis Carto gets his hands on a copy of Imperium and publishes a second edition of it, which is the edition most people are familiar with. And if Yockey was not caught and was not forced to, or did not choose to take the more noble route than being kind of paraded and possibly lobotomized, because they did that back in those days, it's very likely that he would have lived on as long as an individual like H. Keith Thompson did, possibly even into the early 2000s. But I know that was a bit long, but that's kind of a detailed summary of Yockey's lives and going-ons.
Sure. And I don't know if we have the time to do it, but at least we could get started. And if we don't have the time, if you'd come back, that would be great. Let's start getting into a little bit of his political thought, because as you've already talked about, I mean, people read this. Mosley's people read this and they were like, dude, this is insane. There's nothing like this anywhere else. And I think that really the only thing that they could have compared it to at the time would have been Spengler, but he had taken a step beyond that.
Yes, no, that's exactly how to describe it. Imperium is, if I had to recommend one book that any young or not so young